Hey son, picture a Tuesday morning in 1983. The kitchen smells like instant coffee and buttered toast, and somewhere down the hall a television is playing cartoons at a volume that should not be legal. This is where we are going today. If this kind of storytelling speaks to you, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe so you never miss one, and drop a comment below telling me where in the world you are watching from. I love reading every single one. But before we begin, let me ask you something. What did a Monday morning actually feel like in 1982, when your mother was running the house on pure determination and a grocery list written on the back of an envelope? What did the laundry room smell like when she pulled a load from the dryer and folded it on the kitchen table, while the evening news played in the background? What did a family dinner look like on a Wednesday night, when no one had a screen in their pocket and the phone on the wall had a cord that only reached as far as the pantry doorway? What did it feel like to be raised by a woman who operated by a code nobody wrote down, but everybody understood? What were the rules she lived by? The ones that came from her mother and her mother's mother, and somewhere further back than that? It is 1983 now. The coffee is percolating. A neighbor is pulling out of the driveway. The school bus is 3 minutes away. And the woman at the center of this house is already 2 hours into her day. Everything is about to make sense. Before the children woke, before the lunches were made, before the cartoon theme song started bleeding through the walls. There was a window, maybe 15 minutes wide, that belonged entirely to her. You would not have noticed it as a child, but if you were ever up early enough to see it, you would remember it. She sat at the kitchen table in her robe, both hands wrapped around a mug. The house still dark except for the light above the stove. Nobody needed anything from her yet, and she sat with that like it was the most valuable thing she owned. The coffee was not fancy. It was whatever brand was on sale that week, made in a percolator or a drip machine with a cracked lid held shut with a rubber band. It was not the point. The point was the quiet. The particular quality of silence that exists only before a house wakes up, when every room is still holding its breath. The hum of the refrigerator, the furnace clicking on. Outside, maybe a bird starting early, or the distant sound of someone else's car pulling out of a driveway 2 streets over. She sat in the middle of all of that and did not rush it. She might have had a notepad in front of her. She might have been looking at nothing at all. There was no television on, no radio playing the morning show, nothing competing for whatever she was thinking about. This was not meditation in any formal sense. She would not have called it that. It was simply the habit of a woman who knew that the day ahead required everything she had, and who had learned through years of experience to start it from a full place rather than an empty one. By the time you wandered in, rubbing your eyes and dragging your feet across the linoleum, she was already several moves ahead of you. The coffee was made. The mental list of the day was assembled. She knew who needed what and in what order and how long each thing would take. You sat down across from her, and she asked you what you wanted for breakfast, and the morning began in earnest. But for those 15 minutes before you arrived, she had belonged only to herself. The rules of that window were unspoken but absolute. You did not disturb her during it if you were wise enough to understand it existed. Some mornings you stumbled in too early and you could feel it. A slight pause before she smiled at you. A breath she took before shifting into the next gear. You were not unwelcome. You were simply early. The morning had been interrupted, and she absorbed that without complaint and moved on, because that was what the morning always eventually required. What strikes you now looking back is how little she asked for. Not a vacation, not a lengthy break, not a morning off in any formal sense. 15 minutes at a kitchen table with a cup of coffee while the house was still dark. That was the whole requirement. And she protected it with a quiet ferocity, waking before her alarm, setting the coffee the night before, moving through the dark kitchen without turning on the overhead light, so the sound and the brightness would not carry down the hall before she was ready to let the day in. That is harder to find now. The phone is on the nightstand, and it is already awake before you are, already full of things that need your attention. The morning quiet that she carved out by hand is the kind of thing people now pay for in retreats and productivity courses and morning routine guides. She had it figured out in 1982 in a house on a regular street with a drip coffee maker and a notepad from the pharmacy. She just knew what the day cost, and she knew you had to be ready to pay it. She did not go to the store without a list. That was not how it worked. The list lived on the counter, usually on the back of a used envelope or a torn piece of paper bag, and it grew through the week like a slow accumulation of everything the house had run out of or was about to. You might have been the one who reported the low orange juice, or noticed the last of the bread was down to the heels. Those were your contributions. But the final list, organized by aisle in a store she had walked 1,000 times, was hers. Losing it before you got to the checkout was a genuine household crisis. She moved through that store with purpose. Not the vague, browsing purpose of someone with time to spare, but the focused forward movement of a woman with a plan and a budget in 45 minutes before she had to be somewhere else. She did not linger in the cereal aisle comparing the nutritional panels on competing boxes. She knew what she bought. She had bought it before. She put it in the cart and kept moving. You could barely keep up with her on the days she brought you along, weaving through other shoppers with the quiet authority of someone who had mapped this territory years ago and was simply executing the route. The budget was real. She was not shopping with a vague sense of what things cost. She knew exactly what a pound of ground beef ran that week and exactly how many pounds she needed and exactly what that meant for the total at the register. She calculated as she went, carrying a running number in her head, the way some people carry a tune, adjusting when something was more than she expected and compensating somewhere else in the cart. If the roast was too high this week, she would find another way to make Sunday dinner work. She always found another way. The store itself smelled like cold produce and floor wax and the particular warmth of the bakery section near the front entrance. The fluorescent lights were the same color as every fluorescent light in every public building in America in that decade. A flat, even brightness that made everything look slightly more real than it was. The linoleum squeaked under the cart wheels. The freezer cases fogged when you opened them. She moved past the end caps and the promotional displays without being distracted by them, because she had her list, and the list was the point. Coupons, when she used them, were organized. Not loosely shuffled in the bottom of her purse, but folded and sorted by section, pulled out at the right moment with the efficiency of someone who had worked out the system and was not going to let it slow her down at the register. The cashier knew what they were doing when they came to the lane. There was no fumbling. There was no apologizing to the people behind her. She was ready when she got there. By the time she loaded the bags into the trunk and returned the cart to the designated spot, because she always returned the cart, the mental accounting was already done. She knew what she had spent. She knew how it compared to what she had planned to spend. And she knew exactly where to put everything when she got home. Which cabinet, which shelf, which drawer, in what order. So the system that kept the house running could absorb a week's worth of groceries and continue without interruption. The list was where it all started. It was not a small thing. It was the first act of order in a week that depended on order to survive. The kitchen telephone hung on the wall, and the cord stretched just far enough to let her step into the pantry doorway for privacy. She did not talk on the phone during dinner. She did not talk on the phone in front of company unless it was an emergency. She did not stay on the phone so long that it became something other people noticed. These were not rules anyone wrote down. They were simply understood, in the way she understood most things, as a matter of basic dignity. When she did talk, it was focused, warm, and she wrote things down as she listened. The phone ringing was an event in 1983, in a way that's almost impossible to explain now. It interrupted what you were doing. You stopped, you answered, you were present for it. There was no screening, no voicemail in most homes, no way to let it go and deal with it later. If the phone rang, someone on the other end was waiting for an answer. She picked it up on the second or third ring, never the first, because that seemed eager, and she answered with her name or a simple hello, and then she listened. Her half of the conversation was often brief on her end, not because she was not interested, but because she understood that listening was the more important part. You could hear her in the pantry doorway, offering short responses that let the other person know she was there, asking the occasional clarifying question, sometimes writing something down on the notepad she kept on the counter for exactly that purpose. Her voice during these calls was different from her household voice, a register lower, warmer, more considered. She did not gossip, or if she did it with enough discretion that it never reached the children. What she said on the phone and to whom was private, in the same way that letters were private and the contents of her purse were private. There was a line between the interior life of an adult and the information that belonged to the household, and she maintained that line with the same quiet consistency she brought to everything else. You did not know everything she discussed. That was appropriate. When a call came in during dinner, and they did come, she would answer it, say she was in the middle of dinner, and offer to call back. Not apologetically, not curtly. Simply as a statement of fact, as if anyone reasonable would understand. And then she would hang up and return to the table, and the dinner would continue. The call had happened. It had been handled. It did not take over the meal or change the shape of the evening. She came back to the table, the same person who had left it. There are people now who are never fully off their phone, who scroll through dinner and answer messages in the middle of conversations, and are technically present in a room while being somewhere else, entirely. She would not have understood that, not as a technology issue, but as a character one. The phone was a tool for connecting with people who were not in the room. The people who were in the room required your attention first. That was the hierarchy. It was not complicated. It was just the way a person who respected other people moved through the day, and she moved through it that way every single time. It did not matter where you were going. It did not matter how long you would be there. If you were leaving the house, you were presentable. This applied to the children. It applied to the husband, and it applied to her. On days when she had given the whole morning to everyone else and still managed to put herself together before stepping outside. The iron lived on a board in the back bedroom. It came out often. The sound of it was the sound of Tuesday mornings, of school picture days, of visits to the grandparents 3 towns over. The ironing board unfolded with a specific sound, a metallic groan, and then a click as the legs locked into place. The iron itself took a few minutes to heat up, and she would test it with a quick pass over a damp cloth while she sorted the pile into what needed pressing and what could wait. There was a system to the order. The things that could sit rolled up and be handed off while she moved on to the next piece. Collars first, sleeves flat and even, the front placket, each side in turn, then down the back in long, smooth strokes that left the fabric looking like it had just come out of a package. She ironed things that people today would put in the dryer and call done. She ironed her husband's work shirts until they held their crease. She ironed the children's Sunday clothes the night before, so the morning would not require it. She ironed tablecloths for company and napkins when the occasion called for it, pressing each fold crisp and clean with the same focused attention she gave to everything else in the house. The iron was heavy. The work was hot. She did it standing up, in the back room with the radio on low. What the ironing represented was something beyond the clothes themselves. It was the idea that the way you presented yourself to the world was a form of communication, that showing up in wrinkled clothes sent a message, and the message was that you had not paid attention, that you had not thought it was worth the effort, that the people you were going to see did not warrant the preparation. She believed the opposite. She believed that the people you were going to see always warranted the preparation, because that was what respect looked like from the outside. This extended to the children in a way that sometimes required negotiation. You had opinions about your clothes. She had different opinions about your clothes. On school days, the efficiency of the morning meant she picked the battles carefully, but on the days that mattered, the picture days and the holiday dinners and the visits to relatives who would remember how you looked, she held firm. You would be presentable. You would sit still while she ran the iron over your collar one more time. You would walk out the door looking like a child who was being taken care of. Looking back at the photographs from those years, you can see it. Everyone is pressed and tucked. The clothes are not expensive, necessarily. They are simply neat. The effort shows, not loudly, but in the way that real effort always shows, in the absence of things that would otherwise be there. The wrinkles that are not there, the collar that sits exactly right. A woman spent time on that early in the morning or the night before, when she could have been doing something else. She spent it because she believed it mattered. And standing in front of those photographs now, you think she was probably right. Sunday dinner was not a suggestion. It was not a preference. It was the fixed point around which the rest of the week quietly organized itself. She started thinking about it on Saturday, deciding on the cut of meat, checking whether there was enough of the good serving dish. By Sunday morning, the house already smelled like something slow and warm. You sat down together. You did not eat in front of the television. You did not leave the table before she did. And if someone was missing from that table without a very good reason, it was felt by everyone, even if no one said so out loud. The preparation was its own long ceremony. Saturday evening, she might have taken the roast from the freezer to thaw overnight. Sunday morning, she was up earlier than usual, the kitchen already warming with the smell of something in the oven before the rest of the house had finished waking up. By midday, the windows were fogged, and the whole house carried the smell of it, the particular deep warmth of a long-cooked meal, the kind of smell that reaches back through time and lands somewhere in the center of your chest. The table was set properly. This was not a weeknight dinner with mismatched plates and someone eating standing at the counter. The good dishes came out, or the second-best ones, depending on the occasion. The serving bowls were warm from the oven. There was bread in a basket with a cloth under it. There was a vegetable and a starch and a main and something for dessert that she had made the day before and kept covered on the counter. She had thought of everything. The table looked like something out of a magazine, not because she was performing for anyone, but because that was what the Sunday table was supposed to look like. You sat where you always sat. The seating was not assigned in any formal way. It had just solidified over years of Sunday dinners until it was simply the arrangement, as fixed and unremarkable as the furniture. The youngest children sat nearest to her, because they needed the most managing. The conversation started easily, the kind of conversation that comes naturally to people who have been in the same house all week and have things to report, small things, the kind that do not seem worth saying at any other moment, but find their place at the Sunday table. She ate last, or close to it. She was the one getting up to bring the bread, or refill the serving bowl, or retrieve the things she had forgotten on the counter. She moved between the kitchen and the table through the whole meal, and yet she was also fully present at the table when she was sitting, not distracted, not running through the list of what still needed to be done. Just there, at the table with her family on a Sunday. This was, in its own quiet way, the thing she worked the whole week toward. The value of it was not obvious when you were a child sitting there trying not to kick your sibling under the table. It became obvious later when the Sundays without it had accumulated into something recognizable as an absence. The meal itself was not the point, though the meal was usually good. The point was the gathering. The point was the table that held the same people in the same seats week after week, and the woman who made sure of it, who cooked for hours so that for one meal in the week, the whole family sat down together and stayed there until she was ready to get up. When something happened to a neighbor, a friend, a member of the church, the first response was not a phone call. It was food. She would move through the kitchen with a particular kind of quiet focus, assembling a casserole or a pan of brownies or a covered dish of something that reheated easily. You carried it to the door with her. She handed it over and said very little. The dish did the talking. There was a whole grammar to this, which she understood completely and passed on without ever explaining it, simply by doing it so many times that you absorbed it without knowing you had. The choice of dish mattered. A new baby got something that could be frozen and pulled out later, when the exhaustion had set in and no one had thought about dinner. A bereavement got something substantial, a casserole with enough servings that the family would not have to think about cooking for 2 days. An illness got something gentle, a soup or a simple baked dish, something that asked nothing of the stomach. She matched the food to the situation with the same attentiveness she brought to every other act of care. It was not random. It was considered. She kept the ingredients for these dishes in the pantry at all times, because the nature of sympathy was that it was often needed on short notice. You did not have time to go to the store when you heard that someone's husband had gone to the hospital, or that the family down the street had lost their father. You went to the pantry, and the pantry provided, because she had anticipated this, because she always anticipated this, because caring for people was not something she did when it was convenient, but something she had built her household around doing at any time. The dish always came back. That was part of the system, too. Within a day or two of the food being delivered, the dish would be returned, washed, and dried. Sometimes there would be a handwritten note tucked inside it, a few words of thanks. She would read it at the counter, fold it, and put it in the drawer where she kept that kind of correspondence. She did not display it or speak about it. The note went in the drawer, and the dish went back on the shelf, and the cycle closed quietly and was ready to begin again. You watched this happen enough times that you did not think of it as exceptional. You thought of it as what people did. It was only later, when you moved into your own neighborhood and your own life, that you began to understand it was not automatic, that some people did not know this language, that the instinct to bring food to a grieving household was something she had transmitted to you along with her recipes and her grocery habits and her Sunday dinner discipline. You brought a dish to a neighbor the first time without quite knowing why it felt right. Then you understood. She had taught you, not with words, but with casserole dishes carried to front doors on weekday afternoons in the 1980s. There is a directness to it that gets lost in other forms of comfort. A phone call ends. A card sits on a mantel for a week and then gets sorted into a box. But a dish of food lands on the kitchen counter of a grieving house and says, in the plainest possible language, someone knows you are hurting and they took time out of their Tuesday to do something about it. No sentiment required, no performance. Just a covered dish and a woman at the door who stayed exactly long enough and not a minute more. She could not sit down in a room that needed something done to it. This was not a character flaw. It was simply how her attention worked. A pile of laundry in the corner of the living room was not background noise. It was a task with her name on it, and until it was done, part of her was still standing next to it. On the days when everything was in order, when the counters were wiped and the floors were swept, and the folded towels were stacked in the bathroom cabinet, she could finally settle into the couch with something on television and mean it. Those evenings had a particular quality of earned peace. The cleaning had a schedule, even if it was never written down anywhere. Certain things happened every day. The kitchen was wiped down after every meal without exception. The dishes did not sit. Beds were made in the morning before anything else happened in the rooms that contained them. The bathroom got a quick pass every few days and a real cleaning once a week. The floors were swept and then mopped on a rotating basis. The windows got done seasonally. She moved through the house on a cycle she had developed over years of managing it, adjusting as the household grew or shrank, always returning to the same rhythm. She had a specific way of moving through a room while cleaning it. Not frantic, not performative, but steady. She worked from one end to the other, from top to bottom, not doubling back, not skipping ahead. She did not clean around things. She moved them, cleaned under and behind, and replaced them. You could tell which rooms she had finished and which she had not because the finished rooms sparkled in any dramatic sense, but because they had a settled quality, a sense of everything being where it belonged, that the unfinished rooms had not yet achieved. The smell, the cleaning supplies was part of the house's identity. The particular combination of whatever she used on the floors and the kitchen counter and the bathroom tile was something you would recognize decades later if you encountered it somewhere unexpected. That specific chemical warmth, that sharp edge of clean, was the smell of the house being taken care of. Some children grew up associating that smell with punishment or drudgery. For you, it was different. It was the smell of the house returning to itself, the smell of order being restored. She did not make the children feel guilty about the mess they made. She made them understand that they were responsible for cleaning it up, which is a different thing. You made the mess, you cleaned the mess, and then the house returned to the baseline that she maintained. This was not harsh. It was fair. The house was a shared space. The work of maintaining it was shared, proportionally and by age. She was not interested in martyrdom. She was interested in the house running the way the house needed to run, and she distributed the labor accordingly. On the evenings when it was done, when the last dish was put away and the counters were bare, and the living room was straightened and the floor had been swept, and she finally sat down, you could feel it, a change in the quality of the air, almost. The television came on, and she settled into her corner of the couch, with her feet tucked under her, and she was actually there, not mentally running through the list of what still needed doing. She had earned that couch. She had earned that half hour of television and the cup of tea on the end table and the quiet that came with it. And somehow, watching it from the other end of the couch, you understood even then that this was what rest looked like when it had been properly paid for. If she was going to the pharmacy, she was also stopping at the dry cleaner, dropping off the library books, checking on her mother, and picking up the one thing the grocery store had been out of on Thursday. You did not make a separate trip for each thing. You planned, you combined, you accomplished everything in a single, organized loop. This was not efficiency as a virtue. It was efficiency as a necessity. She was managing a household on one income, and every gallon of gas was accounted for before she pulled out of the driveway. The route was planned before she got in the car, not mapped on a screen or calculated by an algorithm. Planned in her head, using a mental map of the town she had lived in for years, sorted by proximity and by the order of urgency. The pharmacy first, because the prescription was the reason she was going out at all. Then the dry cleaner, which was 2 blocks from the pharmacy. Then the library, because the books were due, and the fine, however small, was a waste. Then her mother's, because she had said she would stop by, and she did not say things she did not mean. Then the grocery store on the way home. She kept a list for the car the way she kept a list for the grocery store. Things that needed to be returned to people, the sweater that belonged to a neighbor, the plate from the casserole she had delivered last month, the birthday card she had bought 3 days ago and had been meaning to drop in the mail. These things lived in a specific spot near the front door, a table or a basket or a chair designated for outgoing items, so that when she was heading to the car, she could sweep them up in one pass, and they would be handled by the time she came home. The children who came along on these errands learned patience by necessity. The car was not a source of entertainment. There was no screen mounted in the headrest showing a movie. There was the window and the radio and the particular choreography of your mother moving from the car to the store and back again, reappearing with the errand completed, handing you something to hold while she started the engine. You watched your town from the car, window on these loops, and you came to know it the way she knew it, street by street, landmark by landmark. She was never late to pick someone up because she had miscalculated how long the errands would take. She built in time. She knew the pharmacy had a line on Tuesdays. She knew the dry cleaner took 5 minutes regardless of whether she was the only one there. She knew her mother would want to talk for at least 20 minutes, and she accounted for that 20 minutes in the schedule rather than resenting it. The planning absorbed the variables. The day bent to the plan, not the other way around. What she was doing, without naming it, was protecting her own time by respecting everyone else's. When she said she would be back by 3, she was back by 3. When she said the errand would take an hour, the errand took an hour. The car was not a vehicle for vague intentions. It was a tool in service of a plan, and the plan was always drawn up before the key was in the ignition. That discipline, which looked from the outside like simple reliability, was one of the things that held the household together across 20 years of daily logistics, and it was learned entirely by watching her get in the car. She kept extra, not in the way that people now refer to as stocking up in times of crisis, but simply as a matter of course. There was always a backup can of soup. There was always a second box of pasta behind the first one. There was always enough flour for something unexpected. The pantry was not just where the food lived. It was a kind of quiet insurance policy. The feeling of opening it and finding it full was the feeling of the house being under control. Running out of something basic was a source of real embarrassment, a sign that the system had slipped. The pantry had a logic to it that she had developed over years. The newest things went in the back. The oldest things came to the front. This was not labeled or annotated. It was simply practiced, consistently, every time she came back from the grocery store and unloaded the bags. She would reach to the back of the shelf and shift the existing stock forward, then place the new cans and boxes behind them. First in, first out, applied to a suburban kitchen pantry in 1981. With the same quiet discipline it was applied to commercial warehouses. She had worked it out herself. She knew what was in there without looking. She could inventory it mentally while standing at the counter planning the week's dinners. 3 cans of tomatoes, 1 box of pasta, 1 coming from behind it, enough chicken broth for 2 soups, the dried beans she had bought in September and not yet used, the oatmeal, the canned corn, the rice in the jar with the blue lid. She moved through the contents of her own pantry the way she moved through the town in the car, by a map she had built through repetition and maintained through attention. When the pantry ran low on something, she did not wait until it ran out. She added it to the list when it hit a certain level, a threshold she had established through experience, the point at which she still had enough but only just. Running out entirely was the failure condition, and she arranged her entire system to prevent it. This felt like abundance to the children who opened that pantry and found it full. It was actually discipline, the discipline of a woman who had thought several moves ahead and made sure the board was arranged accordingly. Company could come unexpectedly, and she could feed them. A child could come home from school with 3 friends, and she could feed them. A snowstorm could arrive, and the family could stay inside for 3 days, and she could feed them. This was not luck. This was the pantry, which was the plan, which was her. The pantry's fullness was a direct reflection of how she managed the household, and the household was a direct reflection of how she managed her attention. There is something almost lost now in how she maintained that pantry. The modern version of it involves an app and a notification when something runs low and a delivery 2 hours later. The friction has been removed. The mental inventory she carried around in her head all week, the quiet awareness of what the house had and what it needed, that has been replaced by a system that does not require you to think about it at all. What is lost in that trait is harder to name. Some sense of knowing your own house, some sense of being ahead of it, of being the one who thought of it first. She had that. She had it every single day, without ever receiving credit for it. When you ate at someone else's house, you said thank you when you walked in the door, and you said thank you again when you left, and you meant it both times. She had drilled this onto you before you were old enough to understand what it meant, because the understanding could come later, but the habit had to be in place first. A thank you note was not unusual. A phone call the next day to say the food was wonderful was standard. These were not empty gestures. They were the way she kept the network of relationships around her family intact and warm. The thank you note was a specific skill she taught you. Not thank you for having us and nothing else. That was the minimum, and the minimum was not sufficient. You named the specific thing. The dinner was delicious, and the pot roast was the best you had ever had. The party was so warm, and you had such a lovely time talking to so many people. The children had so much fun, and they were still talking about it on the way home. The note was short, never more than 3 or 4 sentences, but it was specific, and the specificity was what made it mean something. She modeled this herself so naturally that you barely noticed you were being taught. After a dinner at someone's house, she would make the call the next morning, standing in the pantry doorway, with the cord stretched from the kitchen wall, her voice warm and direct. She would thank the hostess for the meal. She would compliment something specific. She would say she hoped they could do it again soon. The call lasted 4 minutes. The effect lasted much longer. The person on the other end of that call felt seen, and feeling seen was the whole point. She understood that the social fabric she moved through was maintained by these small acts of acknowledgement, that the friendships and the neighbor relationships and the church community connections that made her life richer and the household more supported were not self-sustaining. They required tending. They required the small, consistent acts of appreciation and acknowledgement that told the people around her that she noticed what they did and she valued it. The thank you note was not politeness for its own sake. It was the maintenance of something real. You sometimes resisted writing the notes as a child. She was not deterred by this resistance. You would sit at the kitchen table with a note card and a pen, and you would write the note. It did not have to be long. It had to be genuine, and it had to be sent. She would read it when you were done, suggest one small change or none at all, and hand you an envelope and a stamp. You addressed it in your own handwriting. You put the stamp on yourself. She did not do those parts for you, because those parts were yours to do. The lesson, which arrived fully formed sometime in your mid-20s, was that gratitude expressed is not the same as gratitude felt. Feeling thankful for something and communicating that thankfulness to the person responsible for it are two different acts, and only one of them does anything for the relationship. She had no patience for people who felt things deeply but never expressed them, who believed that their internal experience of appreciation was somehow transmitted to others without the work of expressing it. You communicated it. You picked up the phone, or you wrote the note, or you said it face to face. The feeling without the expression was private. The expression was what made it belong to both of you. She knew exactly what was in there and exactly where it was. The children's aspirin was on the second shelf, left side. The Band-Aids were in the middle drawer. The thermometer was in its case next to the cotton balls. She had a system, and the system worked, and nobody was allowed to put anything back in the wrong place if they wanted any peace about it. When someone got sick at 2 a.m, she did not fumble around in the dark. She went directly to what she needed. This was not obsessiveness. It was competence, which in a household with children was the same thing as safety. The medicine cabinet in the bathroom was a modest thing. A mirrored door on a recessed box, the kind in every American bathroom of that era, just wide enough to hold what a household needed and no more. She had made it hold exactly what the household needed. The prescription bottles were in a specific spot, labeled and facing outward so she could read them without picking them up. The over-the-counter things were grouped by purpose. The things for fevers in one place. The things for coughs and congestion in another. The first aid supplies in the drawer below, organized with the same logic. The most frequently needed things at the front. She updated it regularly. When something expired, she replaced it. When something ran low, it went on the list. When the children got old enough that the dosage on the children's bottle no longer applied, she transitioned the cabinet accordingly, adding the adult equivalents and removing the things that were no longer relevant. The cabinet was a living document of where the household was at any given point in time, maintained by a woman who understood that the moment you needed it was never the moment you had time to organize it. She also knew what the medicine was for and how much to give, and when to call the doctor instead. This was knowledge assembled over years from pediatrician visits and the small paperback medical guides she kept on the kitchen bookshelf, the kind that were sold in every drugstore in the 1980s with titles that suggested they contained everything a parent needed to know. She read them. She referenced them. She did not rely on memory alone when it came to dosages. She checked the bottle, and she checked the weight, and she gave what was correct. No guessing. The middle of the night was when the system proved itself. A child woke up hot and crying, and she was already moving before she was fully awake herself. Down the hall in the dark, into the bathroom, second shelf left side, thermometer from its case, back to the bedroom. The whole sequence happened in under 2 minutes because every element of it was where it was supposed to be. She took the temperature. She assessed. She made a decision. She administered what was needed. And she sat on the edge of the bed until the child was calm, enough to sleep again. Then she went back to her own bed. That capacity to respond quickly and correctly in the middle of the night was not innate. It was built, piece by piece, through the habits of organization she maintained every other hour of every other day. The medicine cabinet was just one part of it, but it was a revealing part, because it showed the difference between a household that was prepared and one that was managing. She was always prepared. She had worked out early on that the cost of preparation was modest, and the cost of being unprepared at 2 a.m. with a sick child was something she was not willing to pay. The television was not on all day. That was a rule so fundamental it barely registered as a rule. It came on at certain times and went off at certain times. Saturday morning was for cartoons. The evening news was for the evening news. There were shows she watched, shows the children watched, and there was a clear line between them. The set clicking off was the sound of bedtime. She did not use the television to fill silence. Silence was not something that needed to be filled. The television in the living room was a significant piece of furniture in a 1983 household. It sat in a cabinet or on a console, large and heavy, with a screen that curved slightly at the edges and a row of channel buttons or a dial depending on the age of the set. The remote control, if there was one, was a thick rectangular thing with large buttons that was kept in a specific spot and returned to that spot when you were done with it. You did not lose the remote. She had feelings about losing the remote. Saturday mornings had a ritual quality that nothing else in the week quite matched. You were up before anyone else, quiet in the way children can be quiet when they are motivated, patting down the hall in your socks to turn on the set and adjust the volume before it woke the house. The cartoons ran from early morning until noon, and you watched them from a position on the floor or sprawled across the couch with a bowl of cereal balanced on your chest. She let this happen because Saturday morning cartoons were understood to be a contained thing, a block of time with a beginning and an end, not an indefinite expansion of screen time into the rest of the day. When the cartoons ended, the television went off. That was the agreement, explicit or implicit, depending on the household. The rest of Saturday was for other things. Outside, or a project, or reading, or the kind of unstructured time that children in that era navigated without assistance. The television was not the fallback for boredom. Boredom was handled by the children themselves, and she was not troubled by this because she understood, in a way that did not require research to confirm, that boredom was often the room that imagination walked out of. The evening news was a different kind of television. It was information, not entertainment, and it was watched with a different kind of attention. She sat in her chair with whatever she was working on, the mending or the bills, or simply her hands folded in her lap, and she watched the news the way she read the newspaper, for content. She made occasional comments. She noted when something troubled her. The children who were in the room were expected to be quiet during it, not because the news was sacred, but because it was what adults paid attention to, and attention deserved respect. There were shows she loved, specific programs that she watched every week with the commitment of someone honoring an appointment. She arranged her Thursday evening or her Tuesday night around them in the easy pre-streaming way of a person who simply knew what was on and when. She sat with her tea and she watched her program, and for that hour the household accommodated her, because this was her time and everyone understood it. The television off at the end of the program was as natural as the television on at the beginning. It had served its purpose. The evening could continue. She kept everything in there. A small sewing kit, safety pins, her grocery store card, the checkbook, a pen that actually worked, tissues, her lipstick, a folded piece of paper with phone numbers written on it in case someone needed to be reached. You asked her for something and she had it. This was not accidental. It was the result of being the person everyone turned to when something was needed, and deciding to simply always have it rather than deal with not having it. Opening her purse was like opening a small version of the house itself. The purse was a serious object, not necessarily expensive, not necessarily fashionable in any particular year, but substantial, with real compartments, a proper clasp or a zip that worked, enough interior space to hold what she had determined it needed to hold. She had opinions about purses that were too small to be useful, and she did not carry them. The purse was a tool. It was selected on that basis. When it wore out, it was replaced with something similar, because the system inside it was the point, and the system required a container of adequate size. She knew where everything was in that purse without looking. The checkbook was in the main compartment in its own sleeve. The pens were in the interior pocket, 2 of them because 1 was not enough. The small mirror was next to the lipstick. The folded piece of paper with the phone numbers was tucked behind the checkbook because it was the kind of thing you needed when something had gone wrong, and you needed it quickly and calmly. She had thought through the scenarios. She had organized the purse accordingly. The sewing kit was a small zipper pouch no larger than her palm. Inside it were a folded threaded needle in black and 1 in white, a few spare buttons in an assortment that covered most situations, a small pair of scissors, and a safety pin in 3 sizes. She had used the safety pin more times than she could count. A button off a coat in a parking lot, a hem that had come down before a school event, a strap that had given out at the worst possible moment. She had fixed these things in car vicarages and church bathrooms and the back corners of department stores. She was always ready for them. The children treated her purse as an auxiliary supply cabinet. You needed a quarter for the vending machine, and you asked her purse. You needed a tissue, and you asked her purse. You needed something to write with, a mint, a Band-Aid for the blister you had developed over the course of the afternoon, and the purse provided. She handed these things over without ceremony, without making you feel that the request was an imposition. She had them because she had anticipated that they would be needed, by herself or by someone in her immediate orbit, and anticipating need and meeting it was simply what she did. There is a weight to a well-maintained purse that is distinct from a poorly maintained one. You could feel it when she handed it to you to hold for a moment, to carry to the car, to hold while she found something in it. It had a solidity that communicated organization. Everything in it had a reason for being there. Nothing was in there by accident. The receipts she kept were the ones she still needed. The items at the bottom were not the accumulation of months of inattention, but the deliberate small tools of a woman who had thought carefully about what she might need when she left the house and had made sure she had it. What happened in the house stayed in the house, not because it was shameful, not because there was anything to hide, but because the boundary between private life and public life was a real boundary, and she respected it completely. She did not complain about her husband to her friends in a way that put him in a poor light. She did not tell the neighbors about the argument that happened Sunday. She did not ask her children to carry the weight of adult problems. What stayed in the house stayed in the house. This was dignity, maintained as a daily practice. The distinction she drew was not between good things and bad things. It was between things that belonged to the household and things that belonged to the public. Both kinds existed. The good Sunday dinners and the bad arguments were both household things. The neighborhood gossip and the church social and the conversation at the school pickup line were public things. She moved between these 2 worlds every day without confusing them, without carrying the contents of one into the other, and she expected the same of the people who shared her house. This was not repression in any clinical sense. She had a close friend, one or two at most, with whom she shared what needed to be shared in private with the understanding that it would go no further. That was the outlet. That was the pressure valve. Within those relationships, she could say what was actually on her mind, and she did, and it helped, and then she returned to the household and the neighborhood and the public world and conducted herself accordingly. The interior life was real. It was just not available to general audiences. She was particularly disciplined about not pulling the children into adult problems. They were children. The mortgage and the tension of a difficult month and the worry about the car that needed a repair she could not easily afford were not things children needed to carry. She carried them herself, or she shared them with her husband in the evening when the children were in bed, or she mentioned them to her closest friend in that Tuesday morning phone call. But she did not sit at the dinner table and narrate her anxieties to her children. They were not her audience for that. They were her children. What this gave them, without their knowing it, was a childhood that existed at the right scale. The problems of the household were not their problems. They could be children without also being confidants, without carrying the emotional weight of adult concerns, without growing up faster than they should have because the adults around them were leaning on them. She protected the boundary between what was hers to carry and what was theirs to carry, and the result was a household where the children felt cared for rather than relied upon. Looking back, you recognize this as one of the more quietly demanding things she did. Not losing her temper was one kind of discipline. Not airing her frustrations to the wrong audience was another kind entirely. It required a continuous internal editing, a constant awareness of what she was about to say, and whether the person she was about to say it to was the right person for it. That awareness never relaxed, not on the hard days and not on the easy ones. The boundary held because she held it every day without acknowledgement as part of the basic job of being the adult in the room. The cake was decided. The invitations were sent. The favors were assembled on the kitchen table. The gift was wrapped and hidden in the back of the closet where no one would find it. She did not forget birthdays. She did not send a last-minute card. She did not show up empty-handed. The birthday of every person she loved was written in her calendar in ink, and the preparation for it began quietly, weeks before the day, because the day itself was supposed to feel effortless, and effortless things require the most work. The calendar she kept was a modest thing, a paper calendar, usually with a photograph of a landscape or painting on the top half and the month's grid on the bottom, hung in the kitchen where she could see it while she was on the phone or making the grocery list. Every birthday she knew was written in the box of the appropriate date in her handwriting, small and clear. Doctor appointments and school events and social obligations lived there too, but the birthdays had a different character. They were not obligations. They were things she had decided mattered and written down accordingly. She bought cards ahead of time, not in a frantic rush the day before, when the drugstore selection had been picked over and the only options left were the ones nobody wanted. She bought them with time to spare, during the regular errand loop, pausing in the card aisle with the specific recipient in mind and choosing something that actually suited them rather than something that would simply do. She brought it home and wrote in it that same evening while it was fresh, before the sentiment she had intended to express had faded and been replaced by the generic version. The children's birthday parties required a different level of logistics. She planned them the way she planned the Sunday dinner, with the same attention to what was needed and the same advance work to make sure the day itself could unfold without visible effort. The venue was decided, the guest list was set, the invitations were made or bought and sent with. enough lead time that other mothers could plan around them. She did not invite more children than the space could hold. She did not plan activities that required more coordination than she could manage alone. The cake was almost always homemade. She had 2 or 3 reliable recipes: the chocolate layer cake with the frosting that set firm overnight, the yellow cake with the thick buttercream she tinted in whatever color was requested. She baked it the evening before and frosted it the morning of, and she did not make a production of this. It was simply what you did for a birthday. You made the cake. The store-bought version was a concession available in genuine emergencies and not otherwise considered. What she was doing with all of this preparation was telling the people she loved that they were worth thinking about in advance, that they were worth the Tuesday evening she spent writing the card, the Saturday morning she spent baking the cake, the weeks of quiet planning she brought to the party that looked, on the day, like it had come together effortlessly. The effortlessness was the gift. It said, "You did not have to worry about this. Someone else held it for you." She held it reliably for every birthday of every person she loved for years, and nobody ever came to expect anything less, because she never gave them reason to. When something happened to a neighbor, a friend, a member of the church, the first response was not a phone call. It was food. She would move through the kitchen with a particular kind of quiet focus, assembling a casserole or a pan of brownies or a covered dish of something that reheated easily. You carried it to the door with her. She handed it over and said very little. The dish did the talking. There was a whole grammar to this which she understood completely and passed on without ever explaining it, simply by doing it so many times that you absorbed it without knowing you had. She paid attention to the neighborhood in a way that is harder to describe than it sounds. Not surveillance, not nosiness, but a genuine ambient awareness of the people around her and how they were doing. She noticed when the car that was usually in the driveway was not there for several days. She noticed when the curtains in the house across the street stayed closed through the morning, which was unusual for that particular neighbor. She noticed when she had not seen the woman at the end of the block in a while and filed the noticing away until she had a reason or an opportunity to act on it. This awareness was not effortful in the way that deliberate monitoring would be. It was simply the result of being present in her own neighborhood, of being the kind of person who looked up from what she was doing when she was outside, who made eye contact and said good morning and actually waited for the answer when she asked how someone was doing. The information she gathered this way was used only in service of the people it concerned. It was caring, not prying. The distinction was real, and she knew exactly where it was. When she determined that action was called for, she moved without waiting to be asked. Being asked for help was uncomfortable for most people. Accepting help that had not been requested required less of the recipient and more of the giver. She understood this. She showed up with the food before anyone had to figure out how to explain the situation or ask for assistance. The food removed the need for that conversation. It said, "I know something is hard right now, and I'm not going to make you tell me about it. Here is dinner." That is all this is. The children who accompanied her on these deliveries were learning something they would not be able to articulate for years. That community was not an abstraction. It was a specific thing, a covered dish carried to a specific door at a specific moment when a specific person needed it. That being a neighbor was not a passive condition, but an active practice, carried out in small, deliberate acts repeated over years until they became the character of a street, a block, a network of people who understood themselves to be connected and acted accordingly. There is a version of modern life in which you can live beside someone for 5 years and not know their last name. She would have found this genuinely incomprehensible, not as a moral failure, but as a practical one. How would you know when they needed something? How would you know when to bring the dish? The knowing was the prerequisite. The relationship came before the casserole. You built it in the ordinary days so that it was there when the hard ones arrived. She built it, one conversation and one covered dish at a time. For as long as she lived in that neighborhood, there was always a smell. A candle, a simmering pot, fabric softener drifting from the laundry room, a pie cooling on the counter. She was aware of how the house smelled, in the way that she was aware of how the house looked. It was part of the whole. A visitor who walked through the front door should feel something before they saw anything. The smell of the house was part of the greeting. It was part of the message the house was sending. It said, "Someone lives here who is paying attention." The laundry smell was the most constant. Whatever detergent she used was not just a cleaning product, it was a signature. You could bury your face in a folded towel from her linen closet, and the smell was immediately, completely her house. It was warm and clean and faintly sweet, and it was the same every single week, because she bought the same brand in the same size every single time. And she always had a backup box in the laundry room because running out was not part of the plan. That smell was so consistent over so many years that encountering it unexpectedly in a store or in someone else's house could stop you completely. The kitchen smell changed with the day and the season. Weekday mornings were coffee and toast. Sunday mornings were something in the oven starting early. Wednesday evenings might be the particular savory warmth of soup on the back burner, or the bright, sharp smell of onions going into a pan for whatever was coming next. She cooked most evenings, and the cooking smells were not incidental. They were the first announcement that dinner was coming, a signal that reached you in your bedroom or the living room and began the process of transitioning from whatever you were doing toward the table. In the autumn, she made things that required the oven for a long time. Pot roasts and baked chicken and apple cakes that took the whole afternoon to come together. The smell of these things filled the house by mid-afternoon, and it was a specific kind of comfort that had nothing to do with the food itself. It was the smell of the house working, of something underway, of a person at the center of the household, going about the serious work of taking care of everyone in it. You came home from school and those autumn afternoons, and the smell met you at the door before anything else. She kept a candle in the living room, lit on evenings when company was coming, or on Sundays when the house had been cleaned and she wanted to mark the clean with something warm. It was not scented in any aggressive way, just a quiet addition to the air, a small warmth that said the room was occupied and welcoming. She did not light it every day. The occasional quality of it was part of what made it mean something when it appeared. What she understood, without framing it in these terms, was that the physical experience of entering a space shapes how you feel inside it, before you have done anything or said anything. A house that smells like warmth and food and clean laundry tells you something about the person who manages it. It tells you they are there. It tells you they have been thinking about the space. It tells you, before a single word is spoken, that someone in this house is paying attention to, whether you are comfortable. She paid that attention every day, through the ordinary acts of cooking and cleaning and doing the laundry, and the house communicated it on her behalf to everyone who walked through the door. Not in the way of tracking and surveillance, in the way of a woman running a household who needed to know the shape of the day, who was at practice and what time it ended, who was at a friend's house and whether that friend's mother was home, who was supposed to be back for dinner and what happened if they were not. She carried this map in her head all day, updating it as things changed, without a phone in her pocket and without GPS. She just knew. And the knowing was a form of love that the children would not fully understand until they had children of their own. The logistics of an active household in the 1980s were managed entirely through communication that happened in advance. You could not reach your child once they left the house. There was no device in their pocket. There was no way to send a quick message asking whether practice had run over. The information had to be established beforehand with enough clarity and completeness that she would not need to update it once the day was in motion. So it was established. Before anyone left the house, she knew where they were going, who they would be with, whose house, what time, and what the plan was, if something changed. She held this information the way she held the grocery inventory, as a running mental account that she kept current throughout the day. When one piece of the picture shifted, she adjusted the whole. If a child called from a friend's house to say they were staying for dinner, the dinner table changed shape in her mind, and the driving schedule for the evening was revised, and the expected return time was updated. She did this automatically, without writing it down, because she had been doing it long enough that the accounting was second nature. The question, when, you got home was always the same in form, even if it varied in phrasing. How was it? Who was there? What did you do? These were not interrogations. They were the way she updated her map, filled in the part of the day she had not been present for, confirmed that the information she had been holding in her head for the past several hours corresponded to what had actually happened. The answers were what closed the loop. She listened to them with the focused attention of someone who was genuinely filing the details away. When something deviated from the plan, she noticed immediately. Not because she was watching the clock anxiously, but because the expected piece of the picture did not appear when it was supposed to, and the absence was registered. Dinner time came, and everyone was accounted for except one. She gave it 10 minutes before she called the friend's house, not out of panic, but out of the same practical certainty that governed everything else she did. The plan existed. The plan had not been followed. That required inquiry, and she made it calmly and directly and resolved it without drama in either direction. What the children experienced as ordinary, as simply the way things worked, was in fact a significant ongoing effort. She was running a continuous, real-time logistics operation with no technological support, relying entirely on established communication habits and her own attentiveness. She got it right nearly every time. The children were safe, were where they said they would be, were picked up when they needed to be picked up, were accounted for at the dinner table. This felt like the natural condition of being a child in a well-run household. It was actually the result of years of practiced attention by the person who made the household run. Breakfast before anything else. Clothes decided the night before. Backpacks by the door. Lunches made while the children ate. She moved through that kitchen in a sequence she could have executed in total darkness. The efficiency was not cold. There was warmth in it. There was the question about whether you slept well, and the reminder about the permission slip and the standing joke that appeared every Thursday for no particular reason. The system was the structure, and inside the structure, small moments of actual connection happened every single morning. The evening before was when the morning really began. While you were finishing homework or watching the allotted hour of television or getting ready for bed, she was quietly arranging the pieces that would make tomorrow work. Backpack checked for anything that needed to come back to school. Lunch items assessed against what was in the refrigerator and the pantry. The outfit for the next day considered, and if it needed ironing, ironed and hung on the doorknob so there would be no searching in the morning. She made the morning smooth by putting the friction in the evening, where she had slightly more time to absorb it. The morning itself had a sequence as fixed as any ceremony. The alarm, which she set and kept, did not involve a negotiation. The kitchen came on in stages, the coffee first, then the breakfast components assembled while the coffee brewed, then the lunches made in a focused parallel process while the children ate. She moved between the counter and the table with the particular economy of someone who has made this circuit 1,000 times and knows exactly how much movement each step requires. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was forgotten. She talked to you while she did this, not at length, not about anything that required significant attention from either of you, but steadily in the easy back and forth of people who know each other well enough to communicate in shorthand. She asked if you had your library book. She mentioned it was cold and you should take your heavier jacket. She noted that there was a dentist appointment on Thursday and reminded you in advance so it would not be a surprise on Thursday. These were small transmissions of practical information, but they were also the texture of being known, of being in a household where someone was tracking the details of your days. The lunch she made was not elaborate. A sandwich, something from the night before, if there was any, an apple or an orange. A small treat that varied enough to feel considered rather than automatic. She packed it in a paper bag or a lunchbox depending on the age and the year, and she put it by the backpack, so that the final step of the morning was simply a sweep of the area by the door, collecting everything that needed to leave the house with you. The system was designed to eliminate the searching. If everything was where it was supposed to be, there was nothing to search for. The moment of departure was always the same in its essentials. She checked you over once. The coat, the bag, the face, the general condition of the person who was about to represent the household in the world for the next 7 hours. She said something brief and warm. She sent you out the door. And then she stood at the window for a moment, or you imagined she did, watching until you were out of sight, holding the last image of the morning before turning back to whatever the rest of the day required of her. The school morning was a small miracle of logistics, repeated every weekday for years, made to look like nothing at all. She got dressed, drove to the polling place, stood in line, and voted. Every time. She did not make a production of it. She did not discuss who she voted for in front of the children in a way that told them what to think. But she went, and they knew she went, and they understood without being told that this was something a person did. It was part of the same code as the thank you notes and the casserole dishes and the Sunday dinners. You showed up. That was the rule. You showed up for things that mattered, and some things mattered more than convenience. Election Day in the 1980s had a particular civic texture that is worth remembering. There were no early voting options in most places, no extended windows of weeks to cast your ballot at your leisure. There was a Tuesday, and polling places and hours. You arranged your day around it. She arranged her day around it the same way she arranged it around the dentist appointment and the school pickup and the errand loop. Not because it fit neatly into the schedule, but because the schedule bent to accommodate what was important. Voting was important. The schedule bent. She dressed for it, not formally, not in the way she would dress for church or for a dinner out. But she put herself together before she went, because going somewhere that mattered was something you showed up to properly. The polling place was usually a school gym or a church hall or a municipal building with fluorescent lights and folding tables and volunteers who checked your name against a printed list and handed you a ballot in a cardboard sleeve. She went in, she waited in whatever line existed, and she voted. The whole thing took 20 minutes. She was back in her car before the hour was over. She did not tell you who she voted for. This was not evasiveness. It was a principled position, the same position she held on most matters where her influence over the children's eventual thinking was something she took seriously. She voted, and she wanted them to vote, but she was not in the business of telling them what to think. She told them that the vote was private, that it belonged to the person casting it, and that the privacy was part of the point. The booth was curtained for a reason. The reason mattered. What she communicated without words was the value of participation in the larger things. Not just voting, but the school board meeting she occasionally attended, the neighborhood association when something affected the street, the church committee that organized the food drive. She showed up for the ordinary machinery of community life, not glamorously, not with any public profile, but consistently. She was the kind of person who filled in the background of civic life, who did the unglamorous work that kept the local things running. The children watched this and absorbed it. You voted the first time you were eligible. You did not think carefully about why. It was simply what you did on election day, as natural as returning the grocery cart and writing the thank you note and making the Sunday dinner. She had built it into your understanding of what it meant to be a functioning adult in a community. Not through speeches or political instruction, but through the example of a woman who got dressed on a Tuesday morning, drove to the school gym, stood in line, and cast her vote. Every time, without exception, without fanfare, because it was the kind of thing a person did. The credit card, when she had one, was not for things she could not already afford. It was a tool, not a lifeline. She kept a running total in her head of what had come in and what had gone out and what was left, and she made decisions from inside that number at all times. There was no financial app, no dashboard, no automated alert. There was her and the checkbook register and the discipline to know the difference between something she wanted and something the house needed. The children learned this by osmosis, by watching, by eventually understanding that the things they grew up with were not unlimited. The checkbook register was a small ledger tucked inside the checkbook cover. Every transaction recorded in her handwriting, the running balance maintained in the right-hand column with the careful accuracy of someone who knew that the number had to be right because there was no safety net if it was wrong. She wrote down every check the day she wrote it. She recorded every deposit of the day it was made. She reconciled the register against the monthly bank statement at the kitchen table, going line by line, not because the bank was likely to be wrong, but because she was responsible for knowing exactly where things stood and knowing required checking. The distinction she drew between needs and wants was not a lecture she delivered. It was simply visible in the way she moved through a store, through a catalog, through the ordinary commercial landscape of the 1980s with its television advertisements and its Sunday newspaper inserts, and its constant suggestions that the next purchase was the one that would make the household complete. She looked at these things and made assessments that were grounded in the real number she was carrying in her head. She wanted things. She was human, and she wanted things. She bought them when the number permitted, and she did not buy them when it did not. The layaway system was something she used without any sense of embarrassment. You picked out the item. You put a deposit on it. You paid it off over several weeks in installments, and when it was paid, for you took it home. This was considered, in her understanding of money, the correct way to acquire something you wanted but could not pay for in full at the moment. You waited. You paid. You owned it when it was yours to own. The alternative, putting it on a credit card and carrying the balance at interest, was not something she was willing to do for anything that was not a genuine emergency. And her definition of genuine emergency was strict. The children did not have everything they wanted. This was not neglect. It was the honest condition of a household that spent within its means and communicated that constraint to the children in the most direct possible way, by simply living it. You asked for things, and sometimes the answer was yes, and sometimes the answer was not right now, and sometimes the answer was no. And she gave the answer without guilt and without lengthy explanation, because the budget was what it was, and she was not going to apologize for reality. You understood, over time, that the not right now was always true, and the no was always honest, and neither of them meant you were loved any less. What she gave the children by living this way was not a lesson in deprivation. It was a lesson in proportion, in the understanding that money was a finite resource that required management, rather than an abstract concept that expanded to meet desire, in the knowledge that the things you saved for felt different from the things you simply bought, that the waiting was part of the transaction, that owning something you had planned and prepared for carried a satisfaction that impulse purchases never quite matched. She did not teach this in words. She taught it by the way she lived, every week, every month, every year, inside the honest number in the checkbook register. When something new came into the house, she read the directions before using it. The new appliance, the medicine, the school permission form. She read the whole thing, not because she was slow or cautious, but because reading the instructions was what a responsible person did before operating something unfamiliar. She expected the same from her children. You did not guess. You did not assume. You found out. And if you found out something was not what you thought it was, you adjusted without drama and moved on. The instruction manual for a new appliance was not something she set aside to deal with later. It came out of the box with the appliance, and before the appliance was used, it was read. She sat at the kitchen table with the booklet open in front of her, reading it the way she read anything that required actual retention, actively with the occasional underlining or notation in the margin, going back to reread the parts that were not immediately clear. This took time. She invested the time because she understood that using something incorrectly from the beginning was more expensive, in every sense of the word, than taking 20 minutes to understand it first. The medicine instructions were non-negotiable. Dosage, frequency, whether it should be taken with food, what to watch for, what to do if something unexpected happened. She read the full insert that came folded inside the box, the one printed in the small type that most people set aside, because it seemed like too much information for a simple cold remedy. She read it because the information was there for a reason, and the reason was her family's safety, and their safety was not something she was willing to approximate. You gave the correct dose at the correct interval, and you knew the correct dose because you had read where it was written. The school permission form was read before it was signed. Every line. She wanted to know where the children were going and under whose supervision and what the plan was if something went wrong and who to call and what the school's liability policy was. Other parents signed these forms in the drop-off line without reading them, passing them back through the car window with a scrawled signature and a wave. She brought them inside, read them at the table, asked whatever questions the reading raised, and returned them the next morning with the information filled in completely and correctly. She extended this expectation to the children as early as it was reasonable to do so. When you got a new toy with assembly required, she handed you the instructions before she handed you the parts. When you had a new responsibility, she walked you through it once, fully, and then expected you to remember. When you came to her with a problem that was the direct result of not having read something you should have read, her sympathy was limited and her question was immediate. Did you read the instructions? The answer was usually no. The lesson was usually clear. What she was modeling was a form of respect for information. The instructions existed because someone who knew more about the object than you did had taken the time to write down what you needed to know. Ignoring that was not confidence. It was a specific kind of carelessness that she associated with people who believed their intuitions were more reliable than other people's knowledge. Her intuitions were good. She trusted them in the appropriate situations. But she also knew the appropriate situations did not include every situation, and in the ones where the information existed and was available and had been written down for exactly this purpose, you read it, you found out, and then you knew. One woman, known since before the children were born, or met at the church coffee hour in 1978 and never let go of since. They talked on the phone Tuesday mornings. They met for coffee on the occasional Thursday. What was said between them stayed between them, held with the same discretion she brought to everything else. This friendship was not visible to the household. It ran underneath it quietly, like a river under farmland. It was where she went with the things she could not put in the casserole dish or organize into the pantry. It was where she was known. The friendship had history in it, years of shared context that meant neither of them had to explain themselves from the beginning when something new came up. The other woman already knew the relevant background, already knew the characters, already understood the shape of the situation before a full explanation was given, because the full explanation had been built across years of Tuesday morning phone calls and occasional Thursday coffees, and the kind of long, slow accumulation of shared experience that cannot be replicated quickly. This was not a new friendship. It was a settled one, and the settling was what made it useful. She was different in that friendship than she was anywhere else. Not unrecognizable, not performing a different version of herself, but freer, more direct, willing to say the thing plainly instead of in the careful, measured language she used in the public world. If she was angry about something, she could say she was angry. If she was worried, she could say she was worried without immediately pivoting to the plan for managing the worry. If she was proud of something, she could say so without the modesty that governed how she presented herself in other contexts. The friendship was the place where the editing relaxed. The other woman did the same, brought the things that needed to be somewhere outside her own head, and set them down in the space between them. They talked the way women who have known each other for years talk, in a rhythm that moves between the serious and the ordinary without announcement. From the hard thing to the funny thing and back again. The conversation following the actual contours of their experience, rather than any imposed structure. An hour could pass, and the coffee would be cold, and neither of them would have noticed. She did not talk about this friendship to the children, not because it was secret, but because it was hers, in a way that very few things in a household are purely yours. The grocery list was for the household. The medicine cabinet was for the household. The Sunday dinner was for the household. This friendship was for her, and she maintained it with the same quiet dedication she brought to everything else she maintained, showing up for it reliably, holding up her end of the relationship, being the kind of friend she expected to have. What the children did not understand, could not have understood at the time, was that this friendship was part of what made everything else possible. The reserves of patience and steadiness and good humor that she brought to the household did not generate themselves out of nothing. They were replenished somewhere. They were replenished on Tuesday mornings, in the pantry doorway with the phone cord stretched from the kitchen wall and a cup of coffee going cold on the counter, while she talked, really talked, to the one person who knew all of it. That friendship held her up, and she, held up, could hold everything else. Not dramatically, not at great length, not in a way that required everyone to stop what they were doing and pay attention. But she said it clearly, directly, without making it about something else. She was wrong about the things she said to you on Thursday, and she wanted to say she was sorry. That was the whole speech. She believed that the people she loved deserved to hear it, and she was willing to say it, because she was willing to be the kind of person who said it, She raised children who apologized, and she did it by example. Being wrong for her was a fact to be acknowledged rather than a wound to be defended against. She did not confuse admitting a mistake with being diminished by it. She had a clear enough sense of herself that the acknowledgement of a specific error did not threaten the larger structure of her self-regard. She had been wrong about the thing. She said so. The accounting was settled. Everyone moved forward. The whole transaction was quick and clean in the way that direct things are quick and clean. And the relationship on the other side of it was the same relationship it had been before, perhaps slightly better. The apology was specific. This mattered enormously. A vague apology, the kind that expresses general regret without naming the actual offense, was not something she offered and was not something she accepted. If she had said something sharp to you that was unfair, she named the thing she had said. If she had made a decision that turned out to be wrong and that had affected someone, she identified the decision and acknowledged the effect. The specificity was the evidence of genuine accounting. It meant she had actually thought about what had happened and had arrived at a real conclusion rather than a social gesture. She did not apologize for things that were not her fault in order to smooth over a conflict. The false apology, the one offered as a tool for ending an uncomfortable situation rather than as a genuine admission of error, was something she recognized as a form of dishonesty, and she declined to practice it. If the conflict arose from something that was not her responsibility, she would work to resolve it by other means, but she would not apologize for it. Her apologies were reliable precisely because they were not given casually. When she said she was sorry, it meant something, because she only said it when it was true. The effect on the children was cumulative and significant. They grew up in a household where adults apologized to children when they had been wrong. This was not standard. There were households where the adult was by definition never wrong, where the power differential excused the adult from the same accountability expected of the children. Her household was not organized that way. The rules of honesty and accountability applied in all directions. If she expected an apology from a child who had done something wrong, she was prepared to offer the same when the situation was reversed. You carried this into your own adult life so naturally that you did not notice you were carrying it. When you were wrong, you said so. When you had hurt someone, you named it and apologized. When the apology was owed, you did not make the other person wait for it while you worked out your feelings about having to give it. You simply gave it, clearly and directly, and moved on. You learned this from a woman who stood in a kitchen doorway on an ordinary weekday afternoon and told a child she had been wrong and she was sorry. That was all it took. That was enough to last a lifetime. Not to the children, not within earshot of anyone who might carry it further. She woke up every morning and ran the household and worked if she worked, and worried about everything she worried about, and held the whole structure together with the invisible effort that invisible things require. And she did not, as a rule, say out loud that it was hard. Not because it was not. Not because she was performing, but because she had made a decision somewhere early on that her energy was better spent doing the thing than narrating the difficulty of it. You understood this later, much later. You understood it when it was your turn. The work she did was not small. The household she managed was a complex ongoing enterprise with no days off, no sick leave, no performance reviews that acknowledged what was actually being accomplished. The logistics alone, the grocery lists and the school mornings and the medicine cabinet and the errand loops and the casserole dishes and the birthday preparations and the Sunday dinners, would have constituted a significant workload even without the emotional labor that ran underneath all of it. The worry, the long-term planning, the continuous low-level awareness of everyone in the household and how they were doing. She carried all of it. She carried it without narrating the weight. There is a difference between stoicism and suppression, and she was not suppressing anything. The Tuesday morning phone calls were real. The friendship that held her up was real. The private feelings she carried were real, and they went somewhere appropriate. But she had made a distinction between the interior experience of difficulty and the public performance of it, and she came down firmly on the side of keeping the performance private. The children did not need to know how hard it was. They needed to feel that it was being handled. She made sure they felt that. She handled it. What this gave the household was a particular kind of stability. The ground did not shift under your feet based on her emotional state. The morning was the morning. The system ran. The meals appeared. The house was clean. The birthday was handled. She was there when you needed her, and she was not burdening you with the cost of being there. You could simply be a child in a household that functioned, without carrying any awareness of what it took to make it function, because she had decided that was her job and not yours. You understood it, as promised, when it was your turn. When you were the one up at 2 a.m. with a sick child, and at the office at 8 the next morning and managing the grocery list and the school schedule and the errand loop and the Sunday dinner and the worry that never fully went off, not even at night, not even when everything was quiet. You understood it in the middle of your own ordinary Tuesday, standing at a counter you had wiped for the 3rd time that day, when the full weight of what she had done landed on you without warning, and you had to stand there for a moment and simply absorb it. She was extraordinary in the specific way that ordinary things done extraordinarily well always are. Not dramatic, not celebrated, not visible from any distance, just present every single day. In the kitchen and the car and the pharmacy and the polling place and the pantry doorway on Tuesday. Mornings, doing the thing, carrying the weight, never saying it was hard. Somewhere in the accumulated Tuesdays of an entire life, she built something that held, that still holds, that you are still living inside of, in ways you are still discovering, in ways you will spend the rest of your life finding words for. She never needed the words. She just did the work. And the work was more than enough. It sat in the same corner of the living room for as long as you could remember. A round wicker basket with a lid that did not quite close all the way because of everything inside it. Thread and colors she had accumulated over years, wound on small spools and tucked in without particular order, but retrieved without hesitation. Needles in a small cushion shaped like a tomato. Buttons in a tin that had once held something else entirely. Elastic, bias tape, a pair of small scissors with orange handles. The sewing basket was not a craft supply. It was infrastructure. It was the thing that kept the household's clothing functional between the moments when replacement became necessary, and she reached into it so regularly that its location was as fixed in the geography of the house as the stove or the kitchen table. She mended things. This is a practice so uncommon now that it requires a moment of explanation. When something tore or frayed or lost a button or developed a hole at the knee, the first response was not disposal. The first response was the sewing basket. She assessed the damage the way a contractor assesses a repair, quickly and practically, determining whether the fix was within the range of what she could do at the kitchen table in 20 minutes, or whether it required something more. Most things were within range. A split seam was 10 minutes. A missing button was 5. A hem that had come down was 15 if she was moving quickly. The mending happened in the evenings, often in front of the television, her hands working without requiring her eyes because the stitches were familiar enough to be made by feel. She held the fabric up to the light briefly to thread the needle, then settled back into the couch and worked through whatever needed doing while the program played. There was something companionable about it, the quiet industry of her hands against the sound of the television, the small, satisfying completion of each repair. A shirt that had been pulled from the mending pile went back into the rotation the next morning, restored, the repair visible only if you looked for it. The children's clothes required the most attention. You were hard on your clothes in the way that children are hard on everything, without malice and without awareness, simply through the full physical commitment to play and movement that childhood requires. Knees went through, elbows wore thin, belt loops were pulled until they separated from the waistband. She repaired these things without complaint, not because the repairs were trivial, but because she understood that the clothes were functioning as they were supposed to function, being used completely by a child who was doing the same. She also altered things, a pair of trousers that had been bought with room to grow into, taken in at the waist until the growing caught up, a dress that had been handed down from an older child to a younger one, adjusted at the hem and the shoulders until it fit the new wearer. She moved seams and changed lengths and made the adjustments that allowed clothing to follow a child through several years of use rather than a single season. This was economy practiced as craft. The clothes lasted longer because she made them last, and the household spent less on clothing because of it. What the sewing basket represented, beyond the practical, was a refusal to accept that things were disposable. Objects had value. They were worth maintaining. A shirt was not simply a shirt in the moment you bought it. It was a shirt across years of use. If you took care of it, if you attended to it when it needed attention. She attended to everything in the household this way, and the sewing basket was the most visible symbol of that attention, sitting in its corner of the living room, lid slightly ajar, ready for whatever the week required. Not everything, not in the anxious, compulsive way of someone who does not trust their own memory. But the things that needed to be remembered were written down clearly in a place she would find them, and the act of writing them was part of the act of committing to them. The grocery list, the phone numbers on the folded piece of paper in her purse, the birthdays in the kitchen calendar, the note on the counter for the children coming home from school, the message taken from a phone call, written on the notepad by the kitchen telephone in her consistent, legible handwriting. She wrote things down because she respected the things enough to make sure they were not lost. The notepad by the telephone was a specific object with a specific purpose, and its purpose was never confused with any other purpose. It was for messages and phone numbers and the occasional quick note that needed to be communicated to someone else in the household. It was not for grocery lists, which had their own paper, or for the children's homework, which had its own table. The notepad was for the telephone, and it lived next to the telephone, and when it ran out, she replaced it immediately, because the alternative, a household in which messages were written on whatever was at hand and scattered across multiple surfaces, was not something she was willing to manage. Her handwriting was legible in the particular way of a woman who had learned in an era when penmanship was taught as a subject, with consistent letter formation and even spacing and a baseline that held steady across an entire page. She did not write in the hurried, half-formed script of someone trying to capture information faster than the hand can move. She wrote clearly, because the point of writing something down was that someone, possibly herself at a later moment, possibly someone else entirely, would be able to read it without difficulty. Communication that could not be decoded was not communication. The act of writing things down was also a form of mental organization. She had noticed, early in the years of running a household, that the things she wrote down stopped occupying the part of her attention reserved for things she was afraid of forgetting. The grocery list freed her from running a continuous mental inventory of the pantry. The calendar freed her from holding every upcoming obligation in active memory. The notepad freed her from trying to remember the details of a phone message while simultaneously conducting the rest of the morning. Writing things down was not a concession to a limited memory. It was a deliberate allocation of cognitive resources toward things that required more than a list. The children were expected to write things down too. If she gave you a phone number to remember, you wrote it down. If there was a change to the pickup schedule, you wrote it down. If a teacher had sent home information about an upcoming event, you wrote down the date before anything else happened to the paper. She did not accept "I forgot" as an explanation for a missed commitment that had been communicated clearly and in adequate time. The information was available. The solution was simple. You wrote it down. There is something quietly radical now about the discipline of writing things down. The phone does it for you in a way, catching the calendar invitations and setting the reminders and storing the contact information in a system that does not require your participation. The friction of the notepad and the pen has been removed. What is also removed, and this is harder to measure, is the small repeated act of choosing to commit to something, of picking up the pen and writing it in your own hand, of making the thing real. By recording it, she made things real that way, all day, every day, in her consistent legible handwriting, on whatever appropriate paper was closest to hand. Saturday was the day of energy and activity and errands and social life. Sunday morning was for church if they attended, or for the slow warm ceremony of the Sunday dinner. But Sunday evening, that particular window between the clear dinner table and the moment the school week reasserted itself, was something else entirely. It was the hinge, the place where the weekend turned into the week. And she managed that transition with the same quiet, deliberate attention she brought to everything else, preparing the household for Monday, the way a sailor checks the rigging before a forecast change in the weather. Not with dread, with readiness. The Sunday evening sequence began at the dinner table, or just after it. While the dishes were being dealt with, she was already thinking forward. What did Monday require that was not yet in place? The work clothes, pressed or not. The children's lunches, which could be partially assembled the night before. The backpacks, which needed to be checked against what had come home Friday and what needed to go back Monday. The permission slip that had been sitting on the counter since Wednesday and absolutely could not wait until Tuesday. She moved through these considerations the way she moved through the errand loop, systematically, nothing skipped, everything closed out before she allowed the evening to settle. The ironing board might come out on Sunday evening. The particular work shirt or blouse that would be needed Monday, pressed and hung on the back of the bedroom door so the morning would not require it. She moved through the ironing with the focused efficiency of someone working against the encroachment of the week, using the remaining time of the weekend to absorb the first labor of the next one. The sound of the iron on Sunday evenings was the sound of the weekend ending, but not unhappily. It was the sound of a person making sure things were ready. She checked in with the children during this window. Not interrogatively, not with the tone of a supervisor conducting a review, but conversationally, working her way through what the week ahead looked like for each of them. What was happening at school, whether there was a test coming, whether there was a practice that conflicted with something else on the schedule and needed to be worked out. She gathered this information on Sunday evening so that the Monday morning would not be the first moment anyone became aware of a scheduling problem that had been visible for days. The house was tidied on Sunday evening, even if it had been cleaned in the afternoon. Not a full cleaning, a resetting. The surfaces cleared of the weekend's accumulation. The things that had migrated from their proper places returned to them. The living room restored to its baseline condition. She wanted to wake up Monday morning to a house that was already in order, that did not require her to begin the week by addressing the residue of the weekend before she could move forward into what the week actually needed. The Sunday evening reset was the foundation Monday was built on. What she understood, in the practical and embodied way she understood most things, was that transitions were the hardest moments in any system. The move from one mode to another was where things fell through, where the item sat on the counter unsigned, where the shirt was discovered unironed at 7 in the morning. She managed the transition, absorbed it in advance, so that Monday arrived not as an ambush, but as a continuation. The week came in on its own terms, and she was already there, standing in a house that was ready for it, coffee made, the night before's preparation holding. There was a hierarchy of dress in her wardrobe, and she understood it completely. Not in the written-down, explicitly categorized way of a magazine-style guide, but in the intuitive and practiced way of a woman who had been navigating social situations for decades and had worked out, through observation and experience, exactly what each one required. Church was one level. A dinner with company was another. A school event was another. The grocery store was another. Running a quick errand was another. She dressed accordingly every time without overthinking it, because the thinking had already been done years ago and was now simply knowledge she carried. The church clothes were the best clothes. They were maintained with the most care, cleaned promptly after wearing, hung properly, not subjected to the ordinary use of the week. She bought them selectively, with an eye toward longevity rather than trend, choosing things that would hold their form and their relevance across several years rather than a single season. She was not a fashion person in the way that magazines defined it. She was a presentation person, which was a different thing entirely. She was interested in looking appropriate, considered, and put together, and she achieved this consistently on a modest budget through the simple disciplines of maintenance, fit, and selectivity. For everyday life, she had a practical wardrobe that she moved through without ceremony. The clothes for a Tuesday of errands were not the clothes for a Thursday dinner with friends, and both were distinct from what she wore on a Saturday of housework. She made these distinctions automatically, not as a performance of propriety, but as a form of respect for the occasion, for the people she would encounter, and for herself. Wearing the right thing for the situation was part of being present for it, part of showing up fully rather than partially. She knew what other people were wearing, not in a judgmental way, but in the observational way of someone who moved through the social world with her eyes open. She noticed when someone was underdressed for an occasion, and she felt for them, not contempt, but a practical sympathy, the feeling of someone who knew that the discomfort of being underdressed was entirely preventable and wished it had been prevented. She never said this out loud. She noted it internally, and it reinforced her own habits without requiring her to comment on anyone else's choices. The children were dressed by the occasion too. Or rather, she dressed them by it until they were old enough to dress themselves, at which point she supervised until she was satisfied. The school play required something nicer than the school day. The holiday dinner required something nicer than the school play. She explained the hierarchy without making it oppressive, framing it always in terms of respect for the event and the people hosting it, rather than in terms of judgment. You dressed nicely because the occasion deserved it. That was the whole explanation. What she was transmitting, across years of choosing the right thing to wear to the right occasion, was an understanding that the external and the internal are not as separate as modern thinking sometimes suggests. How you presented yourself shaped how you entered a room, how you felt inside the room, how other people received you, and how the interaction unfolded from there. She was not vain. She was practical about something that had real social consequences. The dress was never the main event, but the dress said something before the main event began, and she made sure it said the right thing. There was a moment every evening when the house changed register. The dinner was done, and the kitchen was clean, and the children had moved through their routines toward bed, and the particular noise of a household in full operation gave way to something quieter and slower. The television might be on at a lower volume. The voices were softer. The movements through the house were less purposeful, more drifting. She presided over this transition with the same steady attention she brought to everything else, understanding that the end of the day was as important as the beginning, that what the house felt like at 9 in the evening shaped what the house felt like at 6 the next morning, and that the quiet was something worth protecting. 8 o'clock was the line. Not rigid, not enforced with penalties, but real. Below a certain age, the children were in bed by 8. Slightly older, and it was 8:30. Older still, and 9 was the expectation. She did not negotiate these times on weeknights because the negotiation itself was part of what the quiet needed to be protected from. The argument about bedtime was louder and more disruptive than the bedtime itself, and she was not interested in the argument. You went to bed at the time you went to bed, and the household settled accordingly. The bedtime routine was hers to manage, and she managed it with a combination of warmth and efficiency that left no gaps for the resistance to take hold. Baths were taken, teeth were brushed, pajamas were on. And then there was the brief window of the actual going to bed, which she handled differently depending on the child and the age. The youngest ones got a story, read from the same books often enough that she could have recited them without looking, her voice even and calm in the dark room, while the child's breathing slowed toward sleep. The older ones got a conversation, brief and easy, the day's last check-in, a moment that belonged to that child alone before the lights went out. After the children were settled, the evening became hers, in a way that the day rarely was. Not completely hers, because she was still available, still the person who would answer if someone called from down the hall, still the one who would hear the cough that meant something and the cough that meant nothing, and know the difference before she was fully awake, but quieter. The particular quality of the house, after 8 o'clock, when the children were in their rooms and the day's work was mostly done, and the television played at a level that did not carry, was something she valued in the specific way you value things that are both earned and temporary. She did not stay up late. This was a discipline with a logic to it that connected directly back to the first segment, to the 15 minutes in the kitchen before anyone else woke up, to the morning that belonged to her first. The morning could only belong to her if she was awake for it, and she could only be awake for it if she had gone to bed at a reasonable hour. The structure of her day was circular in this way, the evening routine protecting the morning routine, the whole thing held together by the consistent discipline of someone who understood that the machine needed maintenance, and the maintenance happened at the edges of the day. What the quiet after 8 gave the household beyond the obvious rest was a daily reminder that the day had a shape. It had a beginning, with the coffee in the dark kitchen, and a middle, with all the work and movement and noise that the middle required, and an end, with the lowered voices and the bedtime routine, and the house settling into its nighttime self. The shape was not accidental. She built it every day, and the building of it was one of the quietest and most essential things she did. The children who grew up inside that shape carry it still, in the way they end their own evenings, in the instinct toward quiet that arrives reliably after a certain hour, in the understanding, absorbed without words, that a day worth living is also a day worth ending well. And so here we are, at the end of the day. The dishes are done. The kitchen light is the only one still on. The house is quiet in the way it only gets after 8 o'clock, when everything that needed doing has been done, and the people you love are accounted for, and the day has finally, fully closed. We have spent some time today inside a world that a lot of people lived in, and not nearly enough people have stopped to honor. Not the headline version of the 1980s, not the neon and the shoulder pads and the pop songs you already know. The other version, the one that happened in kitchens and laundry rooms and pantry doorways, the one that ran on grocery lists and sewing baskets and checkbook registers and casserole dishes carried to front doors on weekday afternoons. The woman at the center of all of it did not ask to be remembered this way. She was not building a legacy. She was making lunches and ironing collars and writing things down on notepads and showing up every single day to a job that had no title and no review and no moment at which anyone leaned across a table and told her she was doing it extraordinarily well. But she was. She was doing it extraordinarily well. Think about what she held. The medicine cabinet organized for 2 a.m. The pantry stocked 1 step ahead. The birthday handled weeks before the day arrived. The thank you note written and sent. The friend who knew everything. The apology given clearly and without drama when it was owed. The vote cast on the Tuesday, every Tuesday, without fanfare. The quiet after 8. The morning that belonged to her first. None of it was loud. None of it made the news. All of it mattered. There is a tendency, when we look back at the past, to flatten the people in it, to reduce them to the era they lived in, to the limitations of their time, to the things they did not have, and the choices they were not offered. And there is truth in some of that. Her world was not perfect, and she would not have claimed it was. But inside that world, inside the specific kitchen and the specific car and the specific neighborhood of a specific 1983, there was a woman of genuine and quiet greatness, who ran a household the way a good captain runs a ship, with awareness and preparation and the kind of steady presence that means the people around you never have to wonder whether someone is paying attention. Someone was always paying attention. She was always paying attention. If you grew up with a woman like this, you know exactly what I mean. You have felt your whole life the particular shape of a childhood spent inside a household that worked, that was warm, that smelled like something on purpose, and had food in the pantry, and clean towels in the cabinet, and a mother who knew where everyone was without a device in her pocket. And if you are still lucky enough to have her, call her. Not tomorrow, today. Tell her you were watching a video about the 1980s and you thought of her and you wanted to say something you maybe have not said as clearly as it deserved to be said. That you see it now. That you understand what it cost. That the thing she built, the quiet, ordinary daily thing she built across thousands of Tuesdays, is still standing. That you are still living inside it. That it was enough. That it was more than enough. If she is gone, then carry her forward, the way she carried everything, quietly, steadily, without making a production of the difficulty. Write things down. Keep the pantry 1 step ahead. Feed the neighbors when something happens. Show up for the things that matter. Keep the house quiet after 8. Let the morning belong to you first. That is the inheritance. That is what she left. Not in a will, not in a document, not in anything that required a lawyer or a signature. In the way you move through a Tuesday. In the way you return the grocery cart. In the way you sit down at a table with the people you love on a Sunday and stay there until everyone is finished. She taught you that. She taught you all of it, and you have been living the lesson every single day without knowing you were still in the classroom. Before you go, if this kind of storytelling means something to you, if it reaches the part of you that is still sitting at that kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with both hands around a mug, while the house is still quiet. Please hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss one of these. Drop a comment below and tell me where you are watching from, and tell me about her. The woman in your life who ran the household and never said it was hard. I read every single comment. Everyone. Take care of each other out there. And if you get the chance today, go ahead and call her.